Shalom Aleichem, good night, Shabbos. Hayom Yom Shishi. Today is Friday. Tish Asa Yom L'Chedesh HaShlishi L'Chadshi HaChoyref Yud Tes Kisev Reish Hashanah L'Chsidus Reish Hashanah L'Dach Hey Tov Shin Pei Hey Hey Tov Shin Pei Hey. Good Yom Tif L'Shana Teva B'Limud HaChasidus V'Darga HaChasidus D'Kosev V'Seichosim. Hashem to bless us all with Hatzlacha and Terev Avodah. Mitech Yira Amitis, Yiras Hashmaim, Yiras Shmaim Amiti, Umidas Chsidios, Kefira Tzena, Beseiner Tzena Akdoshim. So we should all be Zeicha to serve Hashem for real. In other words, not just to do what Hashem says, which is in itself incredibly valuable, but to actually develop a relationship with the Eibishter, which is what the Baal Shem Tov was about and what Chassidus is about. Avoid the pratis, avoid the pnimis. It's personal, it's individual, based on the lesson and the direction and the inspiration and the empowerment that comes from the Alter Rebbe. And of course, this is our Rebbe, our Nasi B'Yisrael. Like the Rebbe said, Hechafad and Rebbe is by mir nito. And by us it's of course the same way. Hashem should bless us with a year of Chassidus and Torah and Avodah and Atzlacha B'Gashmis and Beruchnis. And the Ikir Zalzan de Kasi Ma'adam Malka Mashiach Hafatz Mayonas Chutza is about bringing Mashiach, or Hafatz Mayonas Chutza bring Mashiach, because as the Rebbe says in the Inyana Shal Teres HaChasidus, Hafatz Mayonas Chutza is Mashiach. So Menazem Be'enei Bosa Be'nayim Magashmim. Pedei Elikim Etzmel Tzveisev Hu Yifte Somakal Aveinaisev, in that order. Now, we're learning a Mamer, Basi Legani Tofshin Memhei. I gave you the first, I'm still in the same place. I'm in Aventura, Florida. I decided to give the shiur here and then to move on to my next stop on this trip here in Florida. This shiur is the Schus HaKodeš, Tzvi ben Alexander HaKoyen, Hashem Yimkem Dame. It's also the Schus of Moshe Yehuda ben Tzvi Yossi, Rabbi Moshe Kotlarski. It's Schus for the Fuah Shleima Aruch, or the Fuah Shleima of Mamer Chaim ben Chayet Tzira, and Liebe Breine Bas Alta Miriam, and Shleim Yosef ben Risha, and Baruch Hadassah Bas Gutke, and Chaim Mushka Bas Natal. We're learning Basi Legani Tafshin Memhei. This is the 15th Peirik of the previous Rebbe's Basi Legani, based on the idea that for 20 years the Rebbe learned each year, when he said the Mamer Basi Legani, one chapter, one Peirik of the previous Rebbe's Mamer. So between Tafshin Yud Aleph and Tafshin Lamed, 1951 and 1970, the Rebbe completed a cycle. Then beginning in Tafshin Lamed Af, 1971, he started again. That cycle finished in Tafshin Nun, 1990, and the third cycle began in Tafshin Av, Shnas Tinaseh, and it continued till Hey Tafshin Nayin, 2010. In Tafshin Nayin Aleph, which is 15 years ago, we started to learn Basi Legani Peirik Aleph for the fourth time around, and then according to that cheshbon, we're holding now the 15th Peirik. Now, this is my second class on this Mamer. And as I told you yesterday when I gave the class, I've already given a class on this Mamer. I decided to re-give it because when I taught the class to the ladies, I was limited with time. And I focused more on the beginning and the end of the Mamer than on the middle of the Mamer. So, I'm not going to give you a long background introduction on Basi Legani, but I want to just set the stage for what we're going to be learning today in this class. One of the most predominant topics in the previous Rebbe, Basi Legani, Tafshin Yud, is the sugya of Erin Seif Lamayla Adin Kei Lamata Adin Tachas. It's a Tikkun Zahir, it's a Zahir that says godliness, as high as you go, it's higher, and as low as you go, it's lower. Meaning, it's known everywhere and it's known by no one. That's just the way I appreciate it. Lamayla Adin Kei Lamata Mata Adin Tachas. And the previous Rebbe dedicates 3 chapters, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel, Yud Dal, 12, 13, and 14, to explain first, Lamata Mata Adein Tachlis, the idea that godliness is everywhere. That although in the previous Rebbe's, in the Lashon of Tikkun Ezer, it first says Lamay Adein Kates, and then Lamata Mata Adein Tachlis. When the Rebbe explained it, he explains first the second part, Lamata Mata Adein Tachlis, that godliness is revealed everywhere. And the Rebbe said in the Mamer of last year, Tafshin Chav Daled, that the reason he does it this way is because Lamata Mata Adein Tachlis is easier to understand. And it allows you to have an easier time understanding the Lamay Adein Kates. That as high as you go, godliness is higher. And as I explained in all the classes I've given until now, the sugya of in Seif Lamay Adein Kates has 2 chapters. one chapter and another chapter, really. Tezvav and then Tezayin. But there's a very big difference between the two subjects, as they're explained in Perek Tezvav and they're explained in Perek Tezayin. Perek Tezvav is this year's Perek, and Perek Tezayin, Emir Tzasham Lariches Shanim V'Shalom Tevis, is next year's Perek. And in this year's Perek, the idea of Lamai Lamai Adin Kates, in the words of the Friedrich Rebbe, Klaluse Winyan Tzimtzum. In general, is the concept of Tzimtzum. In other words, Lamai Lamai Adin Kates means that godliness hides in order for there to be a world. To say it in other words, there's two ways to understand the statement Lamai Lamai Adin Kates. One is Lamai Lamai Adin Kates in relationship with the world, and the other is Lamai Lamai Adin Kates as an absolute truth by itself. So in Perek Tezvav, the Rebbe is explaining Lamai Lamai Adin Kates as it relates to the creation. That since there's going to be a world, and the world requires Helen V'Hesed, so the godliness has to hide. The power to hide godliness, the Hein Goreisav, is the idea of Lamai Lamai Adin Kates. The godliness is able to conceal himself and conceal himself and conceal himself and make place for Elames. In next year's Perek, he's going to add a deeper idea, Ladaiti, I think, in Lamai Lamai Adin Kates, which is not that godliness is removed for the sake of the world, but godliness is removed because of the nature of the godliness itself. There's a godliness of darkness which is higher than light. And in Perek Tezvav, that idea does not exist. In Perek Tezayin, it exists. It's Atzmas Averin Seif, which is the higher than Inyan Agilah. Now, in Tafshin Memhei, 1985, the Rebbe said a Mamer Yud Shvat, Basi Legani. And as I mentioned to you yesterday, he doesn't mention the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. He starts with the Alter Rebbe. In this Mamer, Basi Legani, which we're currently learning, he starts with the Alter Rebbe, doesn't mention the Maggid. So in the Mamer of Abba Rosh Hashanah, the Mamer of Yud T'chamisha B'Shvat, the Rebbe, it's clear that he's adding the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid Kvayachal as a hashlama to the fact that he did not mention them in the Mamer of Yud Shvat. And then the third Mamer in the sequence, Yishma Yisrei, which is 1 week after this is B'Shalach. Yeah? In the Mamer of Yisrei, the Rebbe actually does mention, even though it's a hemshech to the Mamer of Basi Legani, which is of Perek Tezvav, the second idea in it says Lamai Lamai Adin Kates, that godliness is hidden not in relationship with the creation, because it's a level of godliness which is about concealment. Meaning, in Tafshin Memhei, in the Basi Legani, he maintains the level of Lamai Lamai Adin Kates, which is spoken about in the Friedrich Rebbe's Mamer. B'klala so Winyan Tzimtzum, Lamai Lamai Adin Kates means the godly power to hide himself, that the Rebbe explains is equal to the godly power to reveal himself. It's Ein Seif Lamata Adin Tachas means to reveal himself. Ein Seif Lamai Adin Kates means to conceal himself. So in Perek Tezvav, he describes Lamai Lamai Adin Kates, Hashem removing himself and his light to allow space for creation. And in the third Mamer of this hemshech, he already mentions the idea, which is negated to next year's Perek, that Lamai Lamai Adin Kates, talking about the union of Seised, Yeshiva Seised, Elyon, godliness which is concealed above the idea of being revealed. In this Mamer, he explains that the concealment has huge advantage. The Lamai Lamai Adin Kates is the Yotzer, it's the treasure, and it reveals in Yidden the inherent treasure which is in each Yid, the Yotzer of Yiddish Shamayim. And he gave us two examples of how that looks. That when God is concealed, number one, it brings out the power of Mesiras Nefesh, especially when compared to the daughter, the Ikvis and the Mashiach, the Hila Mashiach, which is us. And second of all, the Rebbe says that the concealment reveals the inyan of Lada Zeh Atinik, that when godliness is hidden, so there's no light to dazzle and distract, what's left is Hamoyer, the Eibishter himself, and Hashem's Matthias is true but quiet. And it's the reason that even Nashim, Arif, the simplest of people, know about Hashem because they know about Hashem inside of themselves. They know Hashem inherently because they have a deeper inherent sense of the Eibishter's presence. So these are two net results of the concealment. The Tzimtzum of the Eibishter, the Lamai Lamai Adin Kates, and in Perek Tezvav means Tzimtzum reveals a special power of Mesiras Nefesh and a special power of Tmimus and Emunah and a relationship with the Eibishter which is simple and beyond the complex, higher than a sophisticated relationship with Hashem. This was yesterday's class. And today we learn about Tzimtzomim. So in Perek Yud, in the Mamer of Tafshin Yud, Perek Tezvav, the previous Rebbe discusses the idea of Tzimtzum. That creation requires the removal of Ein Seif, because when Ein Seif was revealed, the Keach HaGvul was hidden, and therefore you have to remove the Ein Seif to all the Keach HaGvul to come out, and you'll be able to create worlds. So the Rebbe, our Rebbe, in the Mamer of Tafshin Chafei, 20 years prior to this, explains that chapter in order, as he always did during the first 20-year cycle of teaching the Mamer of Basi Legani. He goes through the Mamer of his predecessor, the Friedrich Rebbe, in order, line by line, or passage by passage, and explains the concept of Tzimtzum. A Tzimtzum is B'shvil HaGilui, and then the Tzimtzum does not affect more because Amoiru Be'ez Galus, and that the Pnimius of Tzimtzum itself is Gilui, and so on. And at the very end of the Mamer of 1965, the Rebbe says it's true that the Tzimtzum serves positive purposes, and the end of the Tzimtzum is Gilui, and the Pnimius of the Tzimtzum is Gilui now as well. But right now, as you and I live, God is hidden from us, and that's the Taj in Seif L'may L'may L'adin Kates. And the ability for Hashem to hide is as infinite as the ability for Hashem to show Himself. 20 years later, the Rebbe said again, the same Mamer, Basi Legani, but he started with that Mamer finished. In other words, in Tov Shin Mem Hey, the Rebbe continued talking about Tzimtzum, and you have to understand, it's based on the idea that the Friedrich Rebbe's Mamer in Perek Tezvav only speaks in Seif L'may L'may L'adin Kates, but Klolos Winyan Tzimtzum. The higher idea is next year. So B'meila the Rebbe in this Mamer also discusses Inyan Tzimtzum, that in order for there to be a world, and if I may repeat again, and in the space of that world there's a special power of Mesiras Nefesh, and a special power of Tmimus, because in the absence of godliness, we're closer to God than we'll ever be. And therefore, children, when they talk to the Eibush, are talking to the Eibush himself. And we wish, as adults, that we should have the same kind of relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in this Maimon, he enhances the concept of Tzimtzum. And what the Rebbe does here is, he speaks what's called Tzimtzumim before the Tzimtzum Rishon. In Kisvei HaArizal, the Arizal talks about Tzimtzum Rishon. And if you look at the Arizal's writings, the Eitz Chaim and so on, you'll see how afraid, how hesitant the Arizal is to raise the concept of Tzimtzum. He's almost apologizing for it. And like it says in Kabbalah, in Chassidus, Ramak L'Yadamina Tzimtzum, one generation before the Arizal, the idea of Tzimtzum Rishon was not known. The Arizal is the first one to introduce this idea of Tzimtzum Rishon. As it turns out, that in later Kabbalah Sfarim, and especially in Chassidus, and what's implicit from here is that this is in the name of the Alter Rebbe. In footnote 33, his primary source is the Avedas HaLevi, the Banas Trasha, who obviously was quoting the Alter Rebbe, that before Tzimtzum Rishon there's many more Tzimtzumim. But before I read the Mamer, I just want to explain to you what happened in 1985, Tafshin Mem Hey, when this whole discussion was developed. I was 19. I was old enough to be aware, but not old enough or wise enough to participate in the discussion. The Rebbe spoke about it twice in the Fabrengen, and once Yisrei and once Tetzav, and I looked up both Sichas. As it says here, the Rebbe calls it Sichas Shabbat Pashas Tetzav Tafshin Mem Hey. The Rebbe spoke about the Tzimtzum before Tzimtzum Rishon. So the old Maskilim Lubavitch got involved in this conversation, and basically what they all were saying is, of course, just like this Tzumim after Tzimtzum Rishon, there must have been Tzimtzum before Tzimtzum Rishon. And the Rebbe adds common sense to the conversation, and as we all know, common sense is most uncommon. So the Rebbe adds the common sense to the conversation. What the Rebbe says is that, if I may use my own words, we do not study God because we don't understand God. We believe in God, we know He's there, but we don't study God, we study Torah. The difference between studying God and studying Torah means we only learn about Hashem the way it's described in the Torah. Why? Because we all understand that at the end of the day, Hashem is not a logical truth. He's an absolute truth. Like it says in the Chuvas Harash, but the Chassidus always brings that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Atzam Hashem Hussein Tzav Baruch Hu, is Nimna Nimnois. The truth of God is way beyond logic. Or as I like to say it in my talks, God is not the essence of logic, He's the creator of logic, and not bound by its laws. And because He's not bound by the laws of logic, you cannot apply logic to Him. You can't say it's not logical to say when you're talking about Hashem. You can't say it's logical to assume when you're talking about Hashem. You can't say and you can't assume because he's above logic. What you can say is that the Torah tells us that when God created the world, he created the laws of logic. And to a very great extent, he conforms to those laws. And inasmuch as the Torah reveals that the Eibishter operates within the parameters of seichel, of reason, we can study him. But when we get to a point where Torah goes quiet and doesn't tell us, quote unquote, what's going on, vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you cannot deduce, you cannot assume that if after the tzimtzum there's this step and this step and this step and this step and this step, that before the tzimtzum there are similar steps. There's no such rule. Because the rule is that safe call safe, at some point logic ends and it becomes absolute. The question is only where. And that's what the Rebbe said, that the truth of the ideas that we're going to learn today isn't because we deduce, we save that since after the tzimtzum there's this sfira and this sfira and this mida and this mida and this parts of and this parts of. So you have to assume that if it exists after the tzimtzum, it must have existed before the tzimtzum in this way. And on that basis you're going to deduce that there's ribui tzimtzum prior to tzimtzum addition. It's logical to say that. But logic is not entitled to an opinion. Because logic only applies once logic is introduced. And therefore you have to say Torah says it. Whereas the Rebbe said it in the Sikha, Kabbalah reveals to us that before Tzimtzum addition there are other Tzimtzumim. And the reason we know it, and the reason we study it, and the reason we attempt to understand it, is because Torah told us that it's there. The logic is not based on the absolute laws of logic, it's based on the fact that the Torah says that even on these higher levels, Kvayachal, the Eibishter conforms, the Eibishter follows the laws of logic. And otherwise you would not be able to say it. And that's what the Rebbe was saying in the Sikh of Tetzaveh, that everyone is discussing what I spoke about in the Mamer Yitzvat. They're all saying, I don't understand what the big deal is. It's obvious, it's logical that all these Rebbes, these levels exist. And the Rebbe says, excuse me, it's not logical at all. In fact, the opposite is logical. It's logical to say that reason begins with oir, that's what the Rebbe says. And above oir, as a metzias of it, there is no logic. And it's only that the Alter Rebbe revealed to us that even the levels above the metzias of it, there's also the rules of seichel, and therefore the rules of ishtalshus, and therefore the rules of tzimtzomim. And the Rebbe says, how the Alter Rebbe knows? It's not my business. Maybe ishtalshus told him, maybe the Eibishter told him. The Alter Rebbe doesn't need any marma kemis, the Rebbe said. It's the number of the expressions the Rebbe used. So the novelty of this shir, Perek Gimel and Perek Dalet and parts of Perek Hey, is that there are tzimtzumim before tzimtzum addition. But that we know this not because it's logical to assume that this is the way it is, but because Torah reveals it. That the edge of logic is not tzimtzum addition; it's much, much higher. It's even higher than the Rebbe says, higher than Moed and higher than Yecheles. The Rebbe says Moed is lower than Yecheles. Because Moed is Yecholti, only Yecholti Lahoyer, and Yecheles is Yecholti Lahoyer and Yecholti Shlei Lahoyer. The Rebbe says Moed is lower than Yecheles. And Yecheles is already a madrege. We have to have a ribui tzimtzumim before it. And at some point, logic stops. We're not sure where that point is. But one thing we know for sure, that if the Rabbeim don't reveal it, we can't deduce it. We can't decide that a level has to be there because logic requires it to be there. You can't apply laws of logic to the absolute Eibishter. So we're going to learn about Tzimtzum. And the reason we're learning about Tzimtzum is indeed that since the Friedrich Rebbe says that this Perek is talking about in Sefer L'mayla Madinketz, and the idea that Hashem hides, so there's space for a world. And in this Mamer, the Rebbe explained that in that concealment that brings out of Yidden, an inner treasure, the treasure of Mesiras Nefesh, and the treasure of Tmimus Adas Tinek. So the Rebbe is explaining Tzimtzum before the Tzimtzum Addition. And he's explaining them based on the fact that the Alter Rebbe revealed that even Koydem HaTzimtzum there are Tzimtzum. In other words, it's not common sense, it's Torah sense. And we begin the class. And it begins, Perek Gimel V'hinei Kedei Levayer Inyan Ha'etza Shel Maila, in order to explain the concept of Eitza, treasure, by the Eibishter, which is the Eitza that the Melech is Mevazbes, to give for the Peki, the Achayel, for the sake of the Anshe Chayel, to win the Milchemes Nitzach and to bring Mashiach Tzidkeinu. Mevi Behem Shechamay, the Rebbe brings in the Mamer. The words of the Zayar, it ain't safe, Shehu Ha'etza Shel Maila. It ain't safe, which is the supernal treasure, is Lamaila Din Ketza, Lamata Din Tachas. Now notice, it ain't safe, Shehu Ha'etza Shel Maila, means that the treasure is it ain't safe. In Tafshin Chavei, the Rebbe said that in Seif Lamala in case is the Eitzer. In other words, it's more special, more specific. And that's how it is in the Frierdiker Rebbe's Mamer and Perek Yud Zayin, that in Seif is not the Eitzer. The aspect of it in Seif of concealment, the aspect of it in Seif of Lamayla in Kates, that's Eitzer. But here the Rebbe says that Oid in Seif Beklal, both the Inyan of Helem and the Inyan of Gilui, are the Eitzer Shalmayla. And of course, if you want to ask a kasha, you can ask a kasha, and if you have a teretz, I'd love to hear it. Even after explaining in the last three parakim, 12, 13, and 14, Gimel and Yudalit, Inyan Lamata Dein Tachas, the concept of godliness being revealed everywhere. He begins to explain the chapter 15, which is the chapter connected to this year, Tafshin Memhei, and now it's 40 years later, Tafshin Peihei, Kibishon Azu, that this year, we're learning Basi Legani for the second time around. And of course, you and I are learning it for the fourth time around. Kifla Yom Tushir, that twice is an name from Chua, and Chua means Ma'asat Tshuva over Tzadikim and so on. That Achrei Shalom Duas Esrema Prakim Shal hemshech, after we learned all 20 Prakim the first time. Hemshech Esrema Shana Marishenis for the first 20 years from Tafshin Yudav till Tafshin Lamed. There's the Gemara says Nalach is Ben Esrim Shana Lim Kevin Lisa V'Nichse B'Nichse Aviv, when a person's a Yosem and he inherits an estate. So the Bezin has to protect him from himself. So there's a series of halachas of how you allow him access to his father's wealth. And the nichse delay naidi, nechosim shesh la machrayas, that means real estate you don't give him access to until he turns 20. And that's Saj ben Esim v'limke v'nichse. There's a Mamer from Alter Rebbe in the Kutetei in Bamidbar, a short little Mamer ben Esim Shona, where he explains this, that only at the age of 20 are you a complete master. And the Rebbe is implying that after 20 years, after the Kabbalah Sanasiyas of our Rebbe, he's ben Esim v'limke v'nichse yaviv. There's the Sipur that in Tafresh Samach Gimel, it was 20 years after the Rebbe Marash passed away. So Sukkot, the Rebbe Marash passed away Yud Gimel Tisha. Sukkot, the Frierdiker Rebbe describes it. The Rashbatz was sitting by the table in the Sukkah with the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rashbatz blurted out, Ben Esrim v'limke v'nichse yaviv. The Rashbatz was a big chassid, he was also a very big goan. And he blurted out that after 20 years, you're a master of your father's Torah. And the Rebbe Rayat says, he was sitting there, the Tata Gonish Gezak, my father said nothing, but the color on his face changed. You saw that what the Rashbat was a big chassid, an Alter chassid, a Greisa chassid, a Breita chassid, a big lampen. And he made the statement, Ben Esem v'limke b'nichse yaviv, and the Rebbe Nishmas HaYedin's reaction showed that it meant something. So the Rebbe is saying that after 20 years, v'limke b'nichse yaviv, and after that you start a whole new madrega of Nesiyas. The second time Kiflayim, but the second time around has Ma'asat Tshuva, and so on. And and this year is the second cycle, the 15th Perek, and for us it's the fourth cycle, the 15th Perek. And we're explaining the significance of godliness being high without an end. If in the last three parakim we explained the idea that godliness is low beyond the purpose, in other words, godliness is found everywhere, you can't hide him. Now he's explaining the opposite. Wherever you're going to go, you're never going to find him, because he's hidden beyond hidden. The Lashon Frierdiker Rebbe's Mamer is Helem acharei Helem, Ilui acharei Ilui, Helem acharei Helem, Ilui acharei Ilui, Beheder ha'er, beheder ha'gilui. And the Rebbe a little bit in the Chavhei Mamer explains these terms. Umavayer bazen, the Frierdiker Rebbe explains the Shem Sheirin Sefer Lamata Mata. Just like there's one idea in godliness that he's found everywhere, he's revealed and radiating without a measure and without a number at all. As it was explained in the earlier chapters. So the same is also true by Cain, who ain't safe, lamaila, mailad and Kates, godliness as high as it's going to be even higher, and the vart is b'bchinas helam. In Hashem's hiddenness that you shouldn't be able to see him. And then he says in parenthesis in Yenat Tzimtzum. And like I said that in the previous Rebbe Maimon, he says, Perek Tezvav, that in Seif Lamaila Amadin, the idea that in Seif is Lamaila Adin Kates, that godness is high beyond an end, goes on the Tzimtzum. The idea that Hashem hides, for the world to exist, that's the power of godliness to be high, to be removed. And he explains that concealing him is as deep an expression of him as revealing him. is an expression of him. And the power of that concealment is what we call Eitzer. The koyach from the concealment is what we call Eitzer. Shu behelam achar helam v'chol. Albeit ha'inyan hu, so let's talk about Tzimtzum. That's essentially how you understand it. That since L'mayla indicates means Tzimtzum, let's talk about Tzimtzum. And the Rebbe starts here where the Friedrich Rebbe finishes. The Friedrich Rebbe begins with Tzimtzum Rishon, basically. And explains the idea that in order for there to be a world, Makam L'midas Eilamis, there has to be removal of Elokus. And the Rebbe says it's Tzimtzum before Tzimtzum Rishon. Now, I just want to say one thing before I read. What the Rebbe is going to do is, the lowest Tzimtzum we're going to talk about is Tzimtzum Rishon. The highest Tzimtzum we're going to talk about is the Tzimtzum of Yechilas. What the Rebbe is going to do is he's going to create the bookends, the Tzimtzum Harishon, then the Tzimtzum of Yechilas, and then he's going to fill in the middle. That there's a number of Tzimtzumim in between the Tzimtzum of Yechilas and the Tzimtzum Harishon. That's how this is going to be structured. That's how it's going to be structured. I wrote on my margin that as the Mamer plays out, the first symptom is going to be the symptom that there should be in the Lakus, the idea of Yechilas, a possibility for everything. The second symptom is going to be, it's based on the Mittel Rebbe in Shari Yichud Perek Yud, which I looked up, that this idea of there's three madregas in Chafetz Chesed, that's what he says, there's three madregas in Chafetz Chesed. And because I think the three madregas of Chafetz Chesed are similar to the three madregas in Ratzon, which the Rebbe Rashab talks about in the first Mamer of Samachei, although it's very hard to make such comparisons. The first madreg of Chafetz Chesed is Eine B'Metzias. The second madreg of Chafetz Chesed is Behelam. And the third madreg of Chafetz Chesed is a Gili of Ratzon for Chesed. The third madreg of Chafetz Chesed, which is a Gili Ratzon for Chesed, is going to be called Shir Atzmei B'Keach Kol Mash Otat Liyad B'Hel. Hashem anticipates what's going to happen. And after that, you have the madreg of Erin Sefer Malei Makam Achalo, which is a Pele. Because normally, we say that the Shir Atzma B'Keach happens after Ratzon. First Hashem has the Ratzon for Elamis, and once he has the Ratzon for Elamis, he's Meshayed how the Elamis are going to be. Here it's much higher. That there's a Chaf, Hashem has a desire to be kind. The end of that desire, the lowest desire, is anticipation of how that kindness is going to express itself. Then you first have the space where the worlds are going to be and how that space is full of light. In other words, the idea that Lefnei Tzimtzum, there's a concept of Mokum, and the Mokum is Moli of Eidin Seif, is a result, comes after the Shir Atzma B'Keach. So if you can count, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Tzimtzumim. The first Tzimtzum is the Tzimtzum for the sake of Yechilas, Yochel for everything. The second Tzimtzum is a Yechilas for one thing in particular, for Chafetz Chesed. The third Tzimtzum is how the Inyan of Chafetz Chesed exists not in Eivin of Yechilas, but Inyan of Helam. The fourth Tzimtzum, how the Chafetz Chesed is the Inyan of Gilui, which is the Eibush anticipating that he wants a world. And the fifth symptom is because he wants a world, there is a world, and that is the idea of Makim, which is full of Eidin Seif. And then the sixth symptom is going to be the Tzimtzum Rishon that we normally talk about. This is how I see this Mamer developing. So the Rebbe talks about a variety of Tzimtzumim. And they're all Lifnei Tzimtzum. He doesn't really explain them in great detail, but he argues the necessity for them. You have to say that all these levels exist. And of course, what's ironic about this is the Rebbe argues that all these Tzimtzumim exist, and then he says in the Sikha, but the proof that they exist is not the argument. The proof that they exist is that it's written in Torah. And if it wasn't written in Torah, you have no proof that it exists, even though logic dictates that it should be, because Hashem is above logic. Verstehst? So that's what's happening here. A ribu tzimtzumim kedem tzimtzum, which the Rebbe explains and argues the need for based on seichel, but the seichel is based on the fact that it's written in Torah. And there's going to be, I wrote it on the margin, what turns out to be 6 tzimtzumim. The last of the 6 is the tzimtzum, what we call the tzimtzum harish. And the way he's going to present it, he's going to explain to us first the lowest tzimtzum and the highest tzimtzum. Tzimtzum harish versus the tzimtzum which allows that in the lakus there should be an idea of yechilas. Yechilas means the possibility for everything. Yecholti lahar and yecholti shalei lahar. And then he's going to fill in the tzimtzum in between afterwards. So he begins, the Hine, Av, Shabbat, Chayemis, and the Kabbalah, the Rizal, it's brought. And that Rizal is the first one that speaks about Tzimtzum. Harish. Because Ramakla Yodamin at Tzimtzum, Shatim, Tzimtzum, who the first event of Tzimtzum was at the Eibush created Makam. And the Makam was full of Eidin Seif. And then it was a Tzimtzum Eidin Seif, it was a contracting, a hiding of the Eidin Seif. Shahol Yamalis Kolamatziz, which fill up all form, all place. And therefore, there was no room to create worlds. So the first symptom is, once there's a space that could hold worlds, you have to remove the 18 saves so that in that space there could be a world actually. And we call that the first symptom. It's brought in Kabbalah. And Chassidus is brought in Chassidus on rare occasion. If you look in all the Mamer Makamis at footnote 33, not in one of them does it say Visham Nisman. I'm wondering if there's more Makoides. When the Rebbe says Huva b'Kabbalah, which Kabbalah sefer does it mean, and so on. Before the first symptom. And the first symptom presupposes that there is Matthias, Makim, and Edin Seif is Mamali that Makim, and then you're removing the Edin Seif from that Makim to be Mamer des Ha'elamis. And we call that Tzimtzum addition. But there are so many Tzimtzumim before that, for that condition to exist, that you can make a Tzimtzum in that condition. And Teda is saying that it's logical to explain, once Teda reveals, Kabbalah, Hina Kabbalah, this is so, that there are Tzimtzumim to set up that reality of having a Makim that's full of Edin Seif, that needs to be evacuated to create Elamis. And the explanation is Alpi Hayadua, based on what it's known. All of us understand that there's an extraordinary distance between the concept of godliness and the source of godliness. That Oyer is infinitely removed, is quantum separated from Oyer, the Madrega of a source with a capital S, because Oyer is Hamshacha. And Oyer is Gilui, and in being Hamshacha, and especially in being Gilui, we call it a Metzias of Oyer. Masha Enken Moed is maybe not a Metzias, but it's certainly a higher Metzias. But there's in Yonim which is even higher than Moed. Like I told you, that the Rebbe says, Moed is only יכולת Lahoyer. And Yecheles is יכולת for Lahoyer or Shalei Lahoyer. So it's a much more encompassing thing. Hinegam be'er gufo, in Oyer itself. In order for it to come down, to extend itself and expand itself, to be a form of light. And the simplest insight is the form of light that it's revealed. Revealed means that it reaches something else, touches that something else, and that something else gets it. You cannot compare light as it emerges to be light and do what light does, which is travel from point A to point B and touch and be touched by what it's interfacing with. There is also the air, which is included in the source. And kolobim kedi over here means not the madrega of koilo, which is a Matthias of air, but the madrega of naisei, which is not a Matthias of air, dinyan ayechelas. Kimavu Tanya, as explained in Tanya. Omizeh, move on, and since we understand, before the air is a Matthias, there's the air the way it's kolo. The mekiv anshagama air shall lift neat tzimtzum, in as much as aid ain't safe as it is before the tzimtzum. Who bebechinas gili is revealed, and it's bebechinas mitzias, it has a form of light. V'haraya, it's filling up the so-called space that's later going to be the space of elamei. So you already have space, which is a mitzias, and you already have oil, which is in relationship with that space. So that oil is already substantially manifest, it's substantially formed. Ubefrat, moreover, not only is there godliness, and not only is the godness revealed in the makam achol, it's revealed in the kind of way where it's proximate to elamis. And of course, the difference between mitzias er and mitzias er shaykh elamis is the difference between what we call the makar of sevav kalam and gilul atzma b'shvil atzma, and the makar of mamala kalam and gilul atzma b'shvil elamis, which is the makar akav. And the difference is that the gilul atzma b'shvil atzma is called sfira sein kate. It's a mitzias of er, but it's mitada atzmos. And the idea of Gilul Atzma B'Shvil Elamis is the makar of Esesfiras Agnuzis, which is after Rotz. So if you have Eidin Seif, which is a Metzias, and especially with the Metzias, which is Shachas Ala Elamis, that oil has been substantially formed to be in that state. And one of the symptoms is that it interferes with the creation. The proof that this Madrega of Eidin Seif is already substantially Metzias is also from the fact that kasher Eidin Seif Malay makam achol, when this godliness fills space, you can't have the form of creation because light and world are mutually exclusive. There's a rule that says you can't put two people on the same chair, right? You can't put two pieces of bread in the same bag. They can't be in the same space. And the philosophical way to say it is one mitzias precludes another mitzias. Each mitzias takes up time and space, And one of the aspects of space is that it's phobic. It pushes away other Metzias. But if something is what's called the Metzias, built-in Metzias Nimtza, it exists, but it doesn't exist existentially. So his existence does not interfere with any other Metzias, which is why we say about Hashem himself that he doesn't interfere with anybody, because he's Metzias, built-in Metzias Nimtza. And that's why we say, Hamoy Rube is Galus, that when the Eibishter creates the world, he doesn't have to hide himself, because he doesn't disturb the world. His light does. Now the light is lower than the source, and if the source does not interfere with the world, why with the light? And the answer is the light interferes with the world because it's already close to the world. Close to the world that it has a form which is so worldly that its form and the form of worldliness are mutually exclusive. So the Gili of Ein Sof is a Metzias to the extent that it's a stira to the Metzias of Eilameis. And by the virtue of the fact that the Gili of Ein Sof is a Metzias to the extent that it's a stira to the Metzias of Eilameis, it's already part of Eilameis. Which shows that this revelation of godliness is oid, has so much Metzias that it interferes with the Metzias of the world. So it's shayach le-Metzias ha'elam is beifen shel shlila al kol panim. It's related to worldliness. It's already part of the worldliness paradigm in a way that's indirect. Being a contradiction to the world is a part of the world. Because if you're truly not part of the world wouldn't contradict you, and you wouldn't contradict the world. You would not meet, you would not cross, you wouldn't bother each other like the Eibishter himself. So Ein Sof, which is Malakol HaMetzias, which the Arizal calls the godliness where the first Tzimtzum takes place, says the Rebbe, that's so worldly that it's worldly to an extent that it conflicts with what world is meant to be. So there has to be a Tzimtzum before that to create that worldliness, that level of godliness that's close enough to the world to be a contradiction to what the world is meant to be. And therefore, there's a necessity to say that there's a Tzimtzum before Tzimtzum Rishon. You have to say this. And again, the Rebbe is saying it logically, but he's saying at the same breath that the reason he's saying it logically is because Teda says so. It's logical once Teda says it. And therefore, the way godliness, lifnei tzimtzum, exists in a way that's memalakol HaMetzias, which is a stira to the Metzias of Eilameis, that you have to have a tzimtzum to be Eilameis. It's mebechinas ha'er hakol. There has to be an emergence of this light which is a Metzias, from the light which is included in the source with a capital S, and not yet a Metzias, which requires inyan tzimtzum. So he just established the need for one more tzimtzum. The tzimtzum we know about is the tzimtzum of the oyer, which is the malakol HaMetzias. And the tzimtzum which we're now learning about, that there has to be a tzimtzum to create that oyer, which is a contradiction to the world that needs to be removed for the world to be able to exist. So far he just added one tzimtzum before the tzimtzum Rishon. Tzimtzum Rishon isn't the Ein Sof, which is malakol HaMetzias. The tzimtzum which the Rebbe adds is the tzimtzum to create that oyer, which is so close to the world that it contradicts the world. And he brings the concept of Yechelis. Once you understand that before the Ein Sof is a malakol makam, you have to have a tzimtzum to create the Ein Sof malakol makam. It explains the Tzemach Tzedek says. Now he hasn't yet mentioned the Mittel Rebbe. The Mittel Rebbe is going to come next. In as far as the idea in which the tzimtzum takes place. Quote, I said that Tzemach Tzedek saw a manuscript in the handwriting of the Alter Rebbe, and I don't know if we have this manuscript or not. He names the madrega of godliness, which is included in Natzmas, which is before the madrega of godliness, which is Malakol HaMetzias, b'shem Yechelis, as the possibility for it. Once we accept that before the Tzimtzum Rishon, that's to be a Tzimtzum to create the Ein Sof, we have to label what the Ein Sof was before that Tzimtzum. And before that Tzimtzum, it's a possibility for it. So there's a Tzimtzum to create Yechelis, the possibility to create it. Then there's a Tzimtzum from Yechelis to create Metzias of Ein Sof, which is Malakol HaMetzias, and in that Madrega there's going to be Tzimtzum Rishon. And the Rebbe now analyzes the question to do. Tzimtzum explains. Tzimtzum Rishon happens in Ein Sof, which is already revealed. The Tzemach Tzedek himself explains it, that Tzimtzum can only happen in a level of godness which is close to worldliness, which is connected to Makam. The level of godness which has to be tzimtzum, there's that kind of eir, where the makim has the tfisas makim in the eir itself. Not in godliness as it exists by itself, which is not connected to makim, say the level of godliness which radiates and fills the makim in the kind of space that it interferes with Metzias ha'elamis, or it's going to be a gilui in relationship to elamis. So his question becomes, if they didn't say, which is put Tzimtzum Rishon, is already so close to the world that it contradicts it, the fact that we call the godness for the tzimtzum, that the first tzimtzum happens in an which is called Yecheles. And the question that Rabbi is asking is it not true that the first tzimtzum happens in the Eidin Seif, which is a Metzias Aveir? But up here now, but based on the introduction we just gave, that there's tzimtzum before tzimtzum Rishon, Yesh Leima, the answer is going to be that although the Tzemach Tzedek seems to describe that tzimtzum Rishon is happening in Yecheles, he's actually not talking about tzimtzum Rishon, he's talking about a tzimtzum which is before tzimtzum Rishon. He's referring also to a level of tzimtzum which is לפני tzimtzum Rishon, before the tzimtzum Rishon. So we're talking about Yecheles, where the Eir is B'klal not a Metzias. It's simply the Yecheles for Eir. And like the Rebbe says in the Siches, Yecheles is the Yecheles both for Eir and for Heder Eir, which is why the Rebbe holds that Yecheles is higher than the Teir Moir. And the Tzemach Tzedek says the Tzimtzum, which allows Eidin Seif to exist, in which Tzimtzum Harishan is going to take place, is the Tzimtzum Madreg of Yecheles. And he explains, there's an emotion, a movement of tzimtzum. Shab'ed HaKol, and this godness which is one with him. And the Eid HaKol is not really Kol, it's Neisei, it's Yecheles. That the tzimtzum and the Eid HaKol creates the Eid, which is Mamali Makam HaKol. There's godness which is one with God. And then there's godliness which is revealed in the space and excludes the possibility of a creation. And in that godliness, the first tzimtzum happens. But in order for the first tzimtzum to happen, that godliness is created by an earlier tzimtzum. And that earlier tzimtzum is the madreg of Yecheles. This level of godliness, which is the godliness which is one with the Eibishter, where the tzimtzum happens, that's going to create Eidin Seif, in which tzimtzum Rishon is going to happen. He calls it Yecheles. The light that's included in the source is on high, and of course it's really higher than Moed, because Moed is only for יכולת Elohim. Yecheles is, the Rebbe says in the Sikh of Tetzav, is יכולת Elohim, יכולת Shalei Elohim. Hurak b'bchinas Yecheles is not Oed, it's a possibility for Oed. Kimavur Sham Baruch, as the Tzemach Tzedek explains at length. So Kvayachal in Atzmos is the tzimtzum that there should be the possibility for everything. And the tzimtzum in Atzmos, which allows for the possibility for everything, creates an Oed which is Kolol. Then there's a tzimtzum that the Oed which is Kolol should come out to be an Oed which is Malim Makam Machalo. And in that Oed there's going to be tzimtzum Rishon. So I guess we have three tzimtzumim so far. The tzimtzum to create Yecheles, the tzimtzum that Yecheles creates Eid, which is Mamalek HaMakam HaChalol, and then the tzimtzum in the Eid, which is Mamalek HaMakam HaChalol, which creates Eid Lameis. What the Rebbe is now going to do in the next paragraph is add a series of additional tzimtzum, but they're going to be in between. The first tzimtzum is to create Yecheles. The second tzimtzum is to create in the Yecheles the possibility for Eid, which is in some kind of Metzias, and in the Eid which is created to be in some kind of Metzias, he's going to split it up into three, as the Mittel that Rebbe does in Shara Yichud Peirik Yud. Behin Onam. Tzimtzum Zeshe Bechinas Yecheles. That tzimtzum, what happens in the level of light which is one with him. So that there should be revealed light, Metzias of it, which is Malakal Makam Achol, Ladayin, and Masvik. By itself, it's not sufficient. Shayi Yal Yoda, that directly from it should be Bechinas Eidin Seif, Amal's Kol Metzias, godness which is such a Metzias, that it's revealed in space in the kind of way. Actually, that it contradicts worlds. The fact that godliness contradicts worlds actually shows on a limitation of godliness. It shows that godliness is worldly to the extent that it can't be both, either it or world. So the Rebbe says it's not enough to have one tzimtzum from Yecheles until that madrega. Since Yecheles' existence is so concealed, the tzimtzum that's going to produce from Yecheles the inyan of Eid is not yet going to be the Eid that's so close to the world that it contradicts the world in a way that's Mamalakal Makam Achalo. There must be intermediate steps, and he's going to say that it's 3 steps. There has to be a tzimtzum for there to be a cheles in Atzmas. Then there has to be a tzimtzum from Yecheles, there should be Eir. And in the tzimtzum from Yecheles, there should be Eir, there's going to be 3 steps. The third of those 3 steps is going to set the stage for the Eir, which is Malakal Makam Achalo. Like I told you before, there are 6 tzimtzumim that we're going to talk about. Yecheles is the first one, the tzimtzum to create Yecheles. And the Ein Seif, Malakal Makam Achalo, is the circumstance which creates the final tzimtzum, which is tzimtzum Rishon. And between the tzimtzum that has Eir and the Madrega of Yecheles, and the tzimtzum, which is removing the Ein Seif to it, Makam Elam, there's a series of middle steps. And he explains what they are. On the tzimtzum, the idea that there's a tzimtzum to create godness, Madrega of Yecheles, and to create from Yecheles a Madrega of godness which is more than Yochel. It's a Metzias of Eir. Adai in any maspik, it's not yet sufficiently manifest. Sheyi ayah, through what should be Bechinas Ein Seif, Amal's Kol Metzias, a level of godness which fills the space of creation in the kind of way that it contradicts creation. In other words, Eir is such a manifest Metzias that it's a contradiction to the world, which is a manifest Metzias of concealment. Godliness contradicts worldliness only when it's a worldly level. And the first Eir that emerges from Yecheles, argues the Rebbe, cannot be sufficiently worldly. And you're going to have a minimum of 3 steps. Now these 3 steps, I mentioned during my introduction to this class, I believe, because, so if you know the Shara Yichud, then he brings in Perek Yud the Yochid Echad V'Kadman. And Yochid Echad V'Kadman L'Cheda is the Madreges which parallel the 3 Madreges in Chafetz Chesed that he's talking about. And I think it's more or less, not the same, but more or less like the Madreg of Ratzon HaMuchal Batzmusei and Racham HaMuchat and Ratzon HaGola, which are discussed in the first Mamer in Samachay and then again in Tavshin Gimel. In other words, there's 3 steps in the development of godliness in a way that brings it proximate to worldliness, and the final step is that godliness is fully manifest, and the level of godliness fully manifest is the source of the Eir, which is Malakal Makam Achal. So as I told you before, what the Rebbe does is he introduces us to the lowest tzimtzum, tzimtzum Rishon. And the highest tzimtzum, the tzimtzum of Yecheles, and the tzimtzum from Yecheles, the tzimtzum that creates Yecheles, and the tzimtzum that creates from Yecheles, Eir. And now he's going to fill in the space in between, that there's a number of steps in between. And the Rebbe continues to explain that even after the tzimtzum that creates a level of Eir, which is called Yecheles. Yecheles means the possibility, not just for Eir, the possibility for everything, including Eir, which means it's a non-specific Yecheles. And then from that Yecheles, you're going to have a tzimtzum, which is going to create, they didn't say, which is a Mali Makam Acholo, and the Rebbe says it's impossible, logically, and again, logic is within the parameters of Torah, that this should happen only in one tzimtzum, you have to have a series of tzimtzum. And he explains it tzimtzum, the middle Rebbe claims the Shara Yichud, and he's trying to Perek Yud. That the middle Rebbe said earlier, when he talked about his bonus. I don't know if you've ever learned the Shara Yichud, but the Shara Yichud begins with a whole arichis about meditation, about his bonus. And after he finishes discussing what his bonus is, then he starts speaking about Seder Ishtalshalos, which starts like Perek Tes or something like that. And when he discussed what his bonus is, he says that his bonus, to be correct, has to be detailed, which includes Alter Rebbe. It's not just contemplating the specifics of the different Giluyim and different Elamis and different Spheres, but you also have to be Mizboin in different Tzimtzumim. And there in Perek Yud, after he makes this statement that his bonus has to be in detail, there's 3 steps, and all 3 steps are connected to Midas HaChesed, which is only one Midah. With only one Midah. So the way the Rebbe would explain it is, Yecheles means the possibility for everything. And then there is Yecheles Lahoyer, which he calls Moyer, which is a possibility for one thing. A possibility is not yet a Metzias, it's simply a possibility. But since it's a possibility for one thing, that level of possibility is a huge jump, it's a huge tzimtzum compared to the Madrega of Yecheles, which is a possibility for everything. And once you have a possibility for one thing, then that one thing emerges from step to step, from possible to included to hidden to revealed, which is 3 more tzimtzumim. So if you wanted to use form, you would say like this: Yecheles is a possibility for everything. Yecheles for Chesed is a possibility for one midah, And from the possibility for chesed till actual chesed, there's יכולת, there's keach hakolol, there's keach hanel, and there's keach hagoli, which is 3 more tzimtzumim. And then in the madrege of rotzen hagoloi, then you have the actual chesed. And what's the chesed? The Eidin Seiv Shemali Makam Acholol. Now the Rebbe, Mittel Rebbe is not talking about Tzimtzumim. He's talking about Hashem's chesed. And he explains that chesed has 3 steps. And the Rebbe is saying if chesed has 3 steps, that means chesed has 3 tzimtzumim. The tzimtzum from Yechelis Beklal to Yechelis for chesed. The tzimtzum from Yechelis to chesed to the Helam of chesed. And the tzimtzum of Helam of chesed to the Gili of chesed. And the Gili of chesed then translates into the Hischastos, into the actual chesed, which is the Eidin Seif Malakal Makam Acholol. Now, you have to appreciate that the Rebbe here is as much as this is detailed, it's not. Because you could start lumdising about maybe there should be one more madrega, one less madrega, I don't know. But it's beyond us to analyze what the Rebbe is saying and question because there's simply not enough information. But al pi svara, al pi seichel, the way it's explained in Chassidus is that Yecholis is not koyach. When you have a Yecholis for chesed, then you can have a koyach atzmi of chesed, and the koyach atzmi of chesed will produce a koyach nelam of chesed. The koyach nelam of chesed produces a koyach goli of chesed, which then produces the chesed itself. Which means, according to the math, there should be one more tzimtzum than the ones we have on this list. The tzimtzum to create Yecholis, then the Yecholis, the tzimtzum Yecholis for chesed, then tzimtzum to create from Yecholis of chesed the etzem of chesed, and then the tzimtzum to create from etzem of chesed the helam of chesed, and the tzimtzum to create the helam of chesed the gili of chesed, and from the gili of the midas of chesed of the eibishter you have the actual hischastos, and that hischastos is the Eidin Seif Shemal Makam Acholol. So the math is missing one, but that's my problem. I'm saying it because this is how I'm thinking it. But the middle Rebbe speaks only about 3. Chafetz Chesed is the first level, and then the Helam of Chesed, in other words, the Atmos of Chesed, and the Helam of Chesed, and then the Gili of Chesed, and the Gili of Chesed is not yet the actual Chesed, it's the Gili of the Midas of Chesed, what he calls the Ashara, and then comes the Eidin Seif She'amali Makam Acholol. Ukmei, for example, when Chafetz Chesed, using kindness and Hashem's desire to be kind as a model, parenthesis, Jezeu Tam Kol Abriya Vat Tzimtzum Rishon, that one of the ideas that explains why the Eibush created the world is Chesed. And I'm sure you know the whole discussion, because now it's become very popular and controversial about why the Eibush created the world. Is it for him or is it for us? And of course in Kabbalah and Chassidus you have the idea of Aveda Tzedek Gavoya. But in Musa and Chkira, it's not Aveda Tzedek Gavoya B'tmiya. Hashem doesn't need it, it's only for us. Teva, Tevel Heitev, and Chafetz Chesed, it's all for us. Because Hashem is kind. So there's a connection between the creation and Hashem's Midas HaChesed found in Sifrei Musar and Sifrei Machshav and Sifrei Chkira. And although the Rebbe brings in the first Mamer of Samach Vav that that's not the real reason because it's a Tam Sichli, and ultimately we say Dira B'Tachtenim, which is an Inyan Atzmi of a Taivis King Kasher. But within the parameters of reason, we do use the Tam of Chafetz Chesed. So the Mittel Rebbe says, within the parameters of reason, we use the Tam of Chafetz Chesed, there's 3 steps in the developing of that Mid of Chesed, which is then going to develop the creation. There's 3 levels in kindness, as it's becoming more and more of a Metzias, and each later level of kindness is closer to actually being kind on the supernal side, on the Eibishter side. And between one level and another level, there's a great Tzimtzum, far greater than the Tzimtzum Berishin. Add until the lowest, the 3rd level of that kindness, which is the revelation of kindness, is only Shir Ba'atma B'keach Kol Mash Osad Liyaz B'Peil. Hashem anticipating in his potential what's going to be actualized later. Shegam Dar Yezu, that even this level of Hashara is Lifnei Ha'er Shayamali Makam Acholol, which is before the light, which fills the space of the void. Now you must understand that this version, that Shir Atma B'Keach is before the Eidin Seif Makam Acholol, is completely atypical. Because normally the way it's explained is that there's Eidin Seif in a state of Gilui, and that in this Eidin Seif state of Gilui, the Alter Rebbe calls it Sfiras Ein Kates. In that there's a Ratzon for Elamis. And the Ratzon for Elamis creates Sfiras Hagnuzas. And it also creates the idea of Makam. Now, is there Makam in the Madrege of Sfiras Ein Kates? You have to say on some level there is. But the Ratzon creates a more Metzias Dikya Makam, and the Inyan of Sfiras Hagnuzas. So Chassidus says that the Ratzon for the Sfiras Hagnuzas comes along with the Hashara. The desire that Hashem has to create the world comes along with an anticipation of how the world is going to exist. The desire is kesed, and the anticipation of how the world is going to exist is the esesfiras agnuzis, which is called hashara. In other words, normally, the anticipation of how the world are going to be comes after ratzon. And the ratzon creates the Ein Sof, which is close to Elames. The ratzon creates makam on some level or on a lower level. But the hashara is after the ratzon. Here, the hashara is before. Hashem anticipates what his kindness is going to be, and on that basis he creates Ein Sof Malam Makam Acholo. And in the Ein Sof Makam Acholo, there's first going to be a ratzon, and in that ratzon is going to be another hashara, which is going to be for Elames B'Peil, and then there's going to be Tzimtzum Rishon. So the hashara which we're describing here is not the hashara which is usually brought in Chassidus. The shir atzma bekeach kol mash os liv b'peil here is not about worlds; it's about kindness. Hashem is anticipating how his kindness is going to be manifest, and as he anticipates how his kindness is going to be manifest, in that anticipation, he anticipates what he needs for the kindness to be manifest. Then he makes a tzimtzum in that anticipation and creates makim, and it says makim where the kindness could be. And then there's first going to be a tzimtzum rishon. And l'chayda the ratzon is after the Ein Sof Malam Makam Achol. In other words, if the Rebbe brings 5 madregas, or I wrote 6 madregas at tzimtzum, you could say, based on the logic and what we know from other places, it's more. But what the Rebbe is certainly doing is he starts off with tzimtzum rishon, the bottom, Yechelis, which is the top, and then he fills in tzimtzumim in the middle. He says there's at least 3. The etzem minyan of chafetz chesed, and the reason that's a tzimtzum l'gabi Yechelis because chesed is only one midah, and Yechelis is for everything. Then there's the helam of chesed, and then there's the gili of chesed, and each later step is a greater tzimtzum. The Ein Sof is brought closer and closer to the reality, and the third step anticipates the possibility of doing chesed. From that anticipation is going to come the Ein Sof Malam Makam Achol, which is the place where the chesed is going to be, and then Esh Yemot you're going to remove the Ein Sof. Tzimtzum Rishon. Shagam Dar Gezu, even the level of Ashara, which is the third step in chesed, not chesed always be'etzem. Now chesed is be'helam, but chesed is be'gilui, it's lifnei ha'eir, shahoya, malam makam achol. It's before the Ein Sof, which fills the space of the vacua, which is the contradiction to Elamis that has to be removed for the Elamis maybe to exist. And the Rebbe doesn't talk about the ratzon, so we don't know if this madrega of Ein Sof is, if this madrega of Ein Sof is before ratzon, you have to add several more tzimtzumim. The Ein Sof makam achol, and then the ratzon for the esesfiras agnuzis, and then the tzimtzum rishon. So the Rebbe says, v'inimu, and it's understood. The gam bechinas chafetz chesed atzmi, the desire for Hashem's kindness on a level of etzem, where kindness is a part of his pshitos. Afapi she'ein chesed mamish, it's not yet kindness. El chafetz bilvad le'inyan chesed, is desire for kindness. That chafetz opnimi etzeras ne'atanig, which means it's the deepest level of anticipatory delight, the way kindness exists on the deepest level of anticipation and not yet actual kindness. That's to be a tzimtzum for this as well. There's no such thing as a light. There's no thing as revelation that doesn't have a tzimtzum before it. Because Yechel is not a metzias of Eir. It's a possibility. And it's not a possibility for Eir, it's a possibility for everything. That from the possibility for everything, including the possibility for Eir, there should be Eir, there has to be a huge tzimtzum. And the first madrega of Eir is chesed and a madrega of etzem. Ki kol Eir v'giloi lamata be'ein hareich b'chinas Yechel, any kind of Eir. And any kind of level compared to the Yechelis for Eir is be'ein hareich, because Yechelis is not a metzias. It's not even a Yechelis for a specific thing, it's Yechelis for everything. So there's a tzimtzum to create Yechelis, and there's a tzimtzum to actualize one of the many things which are included in the singularity of Yechelis, to have a chafetz chesed in a madrega which is itself not a metzias. Now the not metzias of chafetz chesed is what? It's either a specific Yechelis or it's a keach atzmi for chesed, which is itself 2 madregas. But the Rebbe doesn't go into that, and he explains it. The k'me'ir nefesh, using a person as an example. Now appreciate when you use a mashal from people, you're assuming that the same thing that's true by people is true by Elokus. And the only reason you can assume it is because Teda gives us the mashal, and Teda gives us the nimshal, and Teda says that the nimshal applies lifnei tzimtzum as well. The idea that the neshama has the possibility to do everything as a singular possibility is a ma'ilish le'be'erech, as completely, as a completely separated, as quantum separated from any kind of revelation. While the light of the nefesh is already a gili from the neshama. So just like in a person, the light of the nefesh is a huge tzimtzum from the possibility of the nefesh, the idea of light. Same is true in the light of the Eibush is going to come down in the one midah of chesed. That chesed is in Agili. In one way or another, the midas are chesed by the Eibush. There is some kind of revelation. And even if you're holding that the revelation of chesed is a madrega of yecheles, but I say yecheles only for chesed, it's also a tzimtzum from yecheles kloli. But especially if you're holding that it's not a yecheles for chesed, but it's a keich atzmi for chesed, it's a metzias of oir, it's shalei be'erech dinyan yecheles. The possibility in the Eibishter for everything as a singularity is far higher than the possibility of the Eibishter for Chesed, or the idea that Chesed exists in the most theoretical level, on the level of light. And the Rebbe says, from the idea that the Eibush has a Yecheles for everything. They should have the possibility for Chesed specifically, or the tool of Chesed in the most atzmi is take away there's a tzimtzum b'shvil, there's a tzimtzum for this. But specifically the Alter Rebbe says shesh gimel dargis. There's 3 steps in this. Adarg ha'achrena, which is the madreg of shir atzma b'keach kol ma she'asal liyas b'peil. Like I told you before, that in Klal and Chassidus they speak 4 levels: Yecheles, Koyach Atzmi, Koyach Nelam, Koyach Goli. In this case, the Yecheles for Chesed, the Koyach Atzmi of Chesed, the Koyach Nelam of Chesed, the Koyach Goli of Chesed. Koyach Goli of Chesed is what we call shir. Now, if I'm understanding what the Rebbe is saying, there's a madrega missing here. He's quoting the Alter Rebbe, because Yecheles is above Koyach. Is there a Yecheles prati of Chafetz Chesed, or is that level skipped? You go from Yecheles for everything to a Koyach Atzmi of Chesed, or you're going from Yecheles of everything to Yecheles of Chesed, and I think that's how it should be, but the Rebbe doesn't spell that out, because then you have to have not 3 tzimtzumim, but 4 tzimtzumim. A tzimtzum from Yecheles in general to Yecheles for Chesed, and a tzimtzum from Yecheles for Chesed to Koyach of Chesed the Madrega of Etzem, and a tzimtzum from the Koyach of Chesed Madrega of Etzem to the Koyach of Chesed the Madrega of Helam, and a tzimtzum from the Koyach of Chesed level of Helam to the Madrega of Gilui, and the Gilui of Koyach of Chesed is only the anticipation of the world that's going to be, which is the source of the Ein Seif Malam Makam Achol. And then here again you have the Shaila, is the Ein Seif Malkam Achol before or after Ratzon? Because before Ratzon you have to have another tzimtzum for the sake of Ratzon. So the Rebbe brings the extremes are Yecheles and Tzimtzum Rishon, and in between the 3 Madregas and Chafetz Chesed, as the middle the Rebbe says. My question is it only 3, is it more than 3? But it's enough. Because the point of the Rebbe is not to go into the particulars, even though he says that the middle the Rebbe says you have to go into the particulars. The point of the Rebbe is to say that although when the Friedrich Rebbe's Mamer Basi Legani in Perek Tezvav, he speaks about Klolos Inyan Tzimtzum, he starts with Tzimtzum Rishon. Says the Rebbe, there's many tzimtzumim before that also. And afterwards, from the 3rd level, the Ashara level, there's an additional tzimtzum, which is tzimtzum Ein Seif Shemal Komitzias, to remove the Ein Seif, which fills all the space where the Elamas are going to be. What we call tzimtzum Rishon. So in this Mamer, you have the tzimtzum to create Yecheles, the tzimtzum from Yecheles to Chafetz Chesed Atzmi, and then from that to Chafetz Chesed Nelam, which we don't have a name for, to Chafetz Chesed Golu, which is also Shir Ba'atzmi Kol Mash Asli is B'Kayach, to the Ein Seif Malam Makam Achalul, and then tzimtzum Rishon. But in general, it's extreme, and 3 steps in between. That's how the Rebbe presents it, based on the middle of Rebbe's Mamer. And this is the end of this discussion. The idea that before Tzimtzum Rishon there's a series of Tzimtzumim is now over. Perek Hey and Perek Vav, which we're going to learn now, is going to talk only about Tzimtzum Rishon. Meaning to say, now that the Rebbe stepped off the continental shelf, so to speak, to introduce to the Friedrich Rebbe's Mamer about Tzimtzum, Tzimtzumim that he doesn't talk about at all, in this Perek Dalet, which we just learned, for better or for worse, Perek Gimel and Perek Dalet. Now it goes back to analyzing the Mamer of the Friedrich Rebbe and the Tzimtzumim of the Friedrich Rebbe that the Friedrich Rebbe talks about, which is Tzimtzum Rishon. V'hinei. Now that we explained that there's a bunch of Tzimtzumim for Tzimtzum Rishon, at least the Tzimtzum of Yecheles, and then 3 Tzimtzum of Chafetz Chesed, the lowest of which is the source of the Ein Seif Malkam Achol, and then in the Ein Seif Malkam Achol you're going to have Tzimtzum Rishon. So Lavar Yeh says Inyan Tzimtzum Shalamayla. Let's explain more the Tzimtzum Shalamayla, which the Friedrich Rebbe does talk about, which is Tzimtzum Rishon. And the Rebbe repeats, Shazehu, the idea of Tzimtzum is Masher in Seif Lamayla Adin Ketz. The idea of Tzimtzum, which is close when you're not tzimtzum, and it begins with tzimtzum haראשון in the Friedrich Rebbe's Mamer. And we started much higher, is the idea of ein seif l'mayla din kates. And again, in Perek Tezvav, ein seif l'mayla din kates doesn't mean a level of godliness, which is called l'mayla din kates. It's a power of godliness to hide l'mayla din kates. How high is that power to hide? Not that it begins with tzimtzum haראשון, that it begins with יכולת and even higher. So maybe the Friedrich Rebbe explains, talking only about tzimtzum haראשון and not higher. In other words, forget about what we learned in the previous two prakim. Let's go back to talk about what you typically call the tzimtzum haראשון. It says in Kabbalah about the first tzimtzum. And the first tzimtzum assumes that there's makom. And the makom is full of ein seif. And in that makom you're going to create elemis. But in order to create elemis, you have to remove the ein seif from that makom, because that ein seif is enough of a metzias to contradict elemis. Shahol Yabed ain't safe, that there was an ain't safe in the Makam Achalo. And the ain't safe has to be removed to create space for the worlds. The space already exists, but you have to where to put the worlds. In addition to the tzimtzum we spoke about in Perek Gimel and Dalet, which the Friedrich Rebbe does not talk about. Then comes the first tzimtzum, which Arizal talks about, which is also the first tzimtzum. The Friedrich Rebbe talks about tzimtzum haראשון and the first tzimtzum, which is the idea that there is a concept of space. And in that space there's godliness, and the godness is revealed in that space. And the godness is revealed in that space in the kind of way that the godness is so much of a metzias that that godliness and world are a contradiction. And therefore you have to take one away to make space for the other. The tzimtzum zehu dila gadol legamre. This first tzimtzum, as described in Arizal and in the Friedrich Rebbe's Mamer, of having makom filled with metzias aved, that the metzias aved has to be removed to create metzias of elemes. This removal of aved is a great leap. V'gadol mikol mini hatzimtzumim shel yachar. It's far greater than all tzimtzum which are going to happen later. It's not greater than the tzimtzum that happened before Faket, compared to the higher tzimtzumim, which are quieter, but they're much deeper and much more extreme. It's a lower tzimtzum. But in terms of metzias, it's the greatest tzimtzum of all. Because in relationship to the world, it's changing it categorically, right? That's what tzimtzum haראשון means. Siluk legamri. Siluk legamri is not in the Eibush, that siluk legamri is in the makom l'midas elemes. In relationship with the world, it's a radical change, the most radical of tzimtzumim. The first tzimtzum removes the ein seif completely in relationship with the space where the worlds are going to exist. It's lois tzimtzum stam, where you make the light less, or you make the light diminished, or you make the light more formed. You take it away altogether. The great light is removed, and the removal of the great light gives space for the kelim to become a metzias, and for the eira kav to break through the hemshech tzimtzum and come b'shin amos in the form of kav. And he says tzimtzum zeh yesh beis peulas. This initial tzimtzum has two parts. The Rebbe Rashab writes in the Beis that every tzimtzum is two tzimtzums. The first is removing the pnimius, and the second is changing the chitzonius. It's a rule. So in this case, removing the pnimius is removing the ein seif, and changing the chitzonius is bringing back the eira kav. Ha'alef si lo ka'er shayam ala makam achal, removing the light would fill the space, which is el masha eagle atzmei. So remove the ein seif. Shazehu, that this removal of ein seif is masha be eagle atzmei noga by tzimtzum. The madrege of ein seif, which is called eagle, is touched by the tzimtzum. It's explained in other places. Now, Rabbi, I want to explain to you what the Rebbe is saying. There's two madreges in this ein seif mala makam achalo. This level, which the Rebbe is called the lowest level, ein seif mala makam achalo, has two levels. The level which is the source of seif of kalaman, which is called gidul atzmei b'shvil atzmei makam of seif of kalaman, and the level of ein seif which is called mamale kalaman. The gidul ein seif is atzmei b'shvil element, which is the makam mamale kalaman. The difference in the higher level of ein seif, which is mala makam achalo, and the lower level of ein seif, which is mala makam achalo, is the higher level is called sfiras ein kates. The lower level is called es sfiras agnuzis. The higher levels before the rasan fe'elames, and the second one is a result of the rasan fe'elames. But in terms of what we talked about earlier, both of them are after the ashara. L'chayra. Before I wasn't sure, now I'm a little bit less not sure. That the three madregas in Chafetz Chesed, including the madrega of ashara, is higher than both madregas of ein seif mala makam achalo. And the tzimtzum haראשון affects these two madregas of ein seif differently. The madrega of ein seif, which is kedem alei saratz, which is the madrega where you say it's gili, but sfiras ein kates, and as the makar of seif of kalama is called noga by tzimtzum. The tzimtzum doesn't change that oir; it touches it. The Ein Sof remains the same. Before it was eagle, that means infinite and can't come into a keli. And after it's eagle, it's infinite and can't come into a keli. But at least in relationship with the world, it's hidden. Before it was revealed, and now it's hidden. That's noga. Tzimtzum doesn't change the Ein Sof, but affects that in relationship to the creation, it should be hidden. The second madrege, which is after the rotzen, as a spheris agnosis, that oil is actually changed by the tzimtzum. And as explained in other Maimorim, the way that change takes place is because there's a bekia, the tzimtzum rishon removes the Ein Sof, and the Eila Kav fights its way through the hemshech tzimtzum and comes b'shina mahus in a way which is called mazel shayris. It's Ein Sof, but it's a ha'ara compared to the makar of Sev of Kalalman, and that's the second thing. Va'abei hemshech hakav, ubefrat b'negei la'akav, and especially b'negei the kav. The Rebbe is saying that also the Eira Kav has a concept of Noga by a Tzimtzum. And l'chayra, that means before the idea of Chazav V'Heya. The Tzimtzum Rishon takes away Ein Sof. Both the Eir, which is the Makar of Sev of Kalalman, and the Eir, which is the Makar of Mamala Kalalman. And at that point, both of them are Noga by a Tzimtzum. And then the Tzimtzum is going to happen when you bring the Eira Kav back. I think that's how you translate it. Beis hemshech hakav. The Kav comes through the hemshech tzimtzum. And when the Kav comes through hemshech tzimtzum, it's a Shinei HaMahus. And in the idea of the Kav coming after the Tzimtzum, in the Shinei HaMahus, there's something else, which is Shakav hu Kav Kotzer, that the Kav is a small, diminished Kav. The language of the Frierdiker Rebbe is Kav Kotzer. And the Rebbe says in Segrayim, de b'shvil zeh tzarech liyas oid Tzimtzum. This is through a different Tzimtzum, which changes the Kav even more. The zeh gufa shenimshach Kav Kotzer, the fact that the Kav comes on in a way which is short, isn't idea Tzimtzum, another Tzimtzum. So Tzimtzum Rishon removes the Ein Sof. And removing Ein Sof itself, there's two things. Removing the Ein Sof, which is the makar of Sev of Kalalman, and removing the Ein Sof, which is the makar of Mamala Kalalman, and at that point, they're both Noga by a Tzimtzum. The second point of Tzimtzum Rishon is to bring the Kav back. And bringing the Kav back is a Tzimtzum Mamish in Kav, but does not affect the Ein Sof, which is the makar of Sev of Kalalman. And then he says, after you have the second Tzimtzum, which is the Bekiyah, to create the Eira Kav, in the Eira Kav there's another Tzimtzum, there should be a Kav Kotzer. And I don't know what this means, or what this is. So I think there's 4 points, mathematically speaking. There is the Noga by a Tzimtzum in the Eir, which is the Makar of Sev of Kalalman, that's number 1. There's the Noga by a Tzimtzum in the Eir, which is the Makar of Mamala Kalalman, that's number 2. There's the Chazav V'Heya there in Mamala Kalalman, which makes the Tzimtzum in the Kav. And there is how the Kav, which has already come through the Tzimtzum, becomes a Kav Kotzer, which is number 4, which is not a part of Tzimtzum Rishon, and I'm not familiar with this 4th idea. And he finishes by saying, Da'agam sheme'akav zeh nivra ahakach kol seder ishtal. So this Kav is Ein Sof, and it's so powerful that everything that we know is created from this, quote, thin line. Mekom mokom nikra Kav Kotzer is considered a short, thin line, lefayedach egal agadol, compared to the Ein Sof, which is above the Tzimtzum. And certainly it's considered small compared to the Ein Sof, which is even higher than Egal Agadol. And the Ein Sof, which is even higher than Egal Agadol, the Chayda is not an Eir of Gilis, Eir of Helam or Etzem, which I don't know what it is. So in this Pedek Hey, the Rebbe added 4 aspects to the Tzimtzum Rishon, and the 4 aspects of the Tzimtzum Rishon are all happening in the Ein Sof, which is Ma'ala Makam Achalo, and the Ein Sof, which is Ma'ala Makam Achalo, is after all the Tzimtzumim we spoke about in Pedek Gimel and Dalet. Now the next paragraph we already read, so go to Pedek Vav. Vav continues the discussion of Pedek Hey, that we're talking only about Tzimtzum Rishon, and we're not talking about the Tzimtzum, which are before Tzimtzum Rishon, which we spoke about in Pedek Gimel and Dalet. But in Pedek Vav he adds something else, which is that the Tzimtzum Rishon sets the stage for all the later Tzimtzum. Obi Yerin Tzimtzum Rishon, to explain the first Tzimtzum more. And again, what I understand it to mean, how the Tzimtzum Rishon is the source of all the Tzimtzum that are going to be later. Yuv and Api Mashmavayek Vegidush Mamer Shab Nishmasayed, and he brings the Rebbe Rashab in Ayin Beis and Samach Vav Echshatzim Tzimtzum, and in addition to the many aspects which we talked about regarding the Tzimtzum Rishon, which is in the Ein Sof Shemali Makam Achalo. In addition, it's a makar l'chala Tzimtzumim, it's a source for the later Tzimtzumim, shebeshvil esavas kela elam, is creation of all the worlds, ad elam hazatach, the lowest world. That the Tzimtzum Rishon not only produces a new kind of Eir Akav, and the Eir Akav itself is the Eir Kotzer, but it also produces the possibility for the tzimtzumim that are going to happen as you go through Seder Ishtalshalos. Ein Seif yesh be'ed habligvul ve'keach hagvul. Ein Seif has everything inside of itself. Eid, which is infinite, and a koyach hagvul. He doesn't call it oid hagvul, he calls it koyach hagvul. There's a difference between oid hagvul and koyach hagvul. The fact that before the tzimtzum there could be no worlds, it's because before the tzimtzum the Ein Seif habligvul was revealed. And as an automatic result, koyach hagvul u'behelam. This point, by the way, is also found in the Mamer of Tav Shin Chav Hey, at the end of some Perek. The end of Perek Gimel, I wrote on the margin. That if Ein Seif includes everything, koyach hagvul and koyach habligvul, why do you have to remove the Ein Seif? To create Elamis, the koyach hagvul is Elamis. So he explains that the Alter Rebbe is explaining that Lifnei Tzimtzum, even though there is a koyach habligvul, the koyach habligvul dominates and suppresses the koyach hagvul. The Ein Seif, Lifnei Tzimtzum, does not allow the koyach hagvul to come out. Which is one of the reasons for the tzimtzum. That silik edi agod lalatzad, that removes the madrega of Ein Seif, which is Matthias, that fills the Matthias, is moved aside. Hainu alam is eid ha-beligavul, it removes the Ein Seif, which is beligavul. And as a result, v'gilui koyach hagvul, it reveals not just the eid hagvul, but the koyach hagvul, the possibility for limitations, which is makam lamidas elam, is a place where worlds could be. Umavayir shaman, the Rebbe Rashab goes on to say that once you have the removal of the Ein Seif and the revelation of koyach hagvul, it sets up all the tzimtzumim that are going to happen after. Prate, ifani tzimtzumim that are going to happen after the tzimtzum rishon. That because of tzimtzumim of b'shem avai b'shem elikim, that there's the b'shem avai which reveals, the b'shem elikim which conceals, and there's a series of steps of elikim covering avaya. All of those steps, all of those tzimtzumim are predicated on the initial step, which is to hide the koyach habligvul, which doesn't allow any tzimtzumim to happen, and reveal the koyach hagvul, which creates the space for all the tzimtzumim after the first tzimtzum to take place. V'atzimtzumim shalamata mizeh. Achenim she'ad l'sfiras ha'malchus, until the lowest tzimtzum, which is malchus, shayadahi yisavas ha'elam et biyah, which creates the lower worlds, and l'chayr, this is even lower than shem elikim. Ve'eid zeis, in addition to the tzimtzum of avaya and the tzimtzum of elikim, the tzimtzum of malchus, there's a tzimtzum of klipa. The tzimtzum rishon yachakach shviras ha'kelim. The tzimtzum rishon sets the stage for the ultimate shviras ha'kelim of teu. It creates this world, including klipas gave it in bay, that this allows for additional tzimtzum. The tzimtzum rishon sets up the tzimtzum of shem avaya and the tzimtzum of shem elikim and the tzimtzum of malchus, which all in turn set up the tzimtzum of klipa, which is also a byproduct of the tzimtzum rishon, but it shows itself at the bottom of Seder Ishtalshalos. The sheirish inyan zeh b'shviras ha'kelim de teu. Stop. All the Rebbe did in this shir, which was Perek Gimel, Perek Dalet, the first paragraph of Perek Hey, and then the first, let's say, half of the first paragraph of Perek Vav, is explained tzimtzumim. First of all, where tzimtzumim begin, Lifnei Tzimtzum. Second of all, the tzimtzum rishon, and third of all, the tzimtzumim that happen after tzimtzum rishon. Perek Gimel and Dalet explain the tzimtzum that happened before tzimtzum rishon. Perek Hey explains the different aspects of the tzimtzum rishon itself, and Perek Vav explains the tzimtzum which are going to happen after tzimtzum rishon. Now, I probably could have taught this more crisply than I did. I was a little bit verbose and I wasn't so careful. What can I say? I'm human. Shkiyas mi yavan. But first of all, the basic point of this shir is clear. And I think to a great extent the particulars are also clear, although maybe I have confused you by constantly pointing out the possibility for more levels that are not mentioned here explicitly. But this class is missing something very fundamental, which is, what's the religious point of all of this? What's the Eirah B'chaim? It just describes a Kabbalistic sequence of tzimtzumim. The chassidus of this was in the class I gave you yesterday. That all of these tzimtzumim, beginning with the tzimtzum that creates Yecheles, and the tzimtzum from Yecheles to Chafetz Chesed, and the three tzimtzumim in Chafetz Chesed itself, and that the lowest of these tzimtzumim is the source of Ein Seif Malakol Makam Achalo, and the Seif Makam Achalo itself has two madreges, the Mokar of Seif of Kalam, the Mokar of Malakalam, and then in them you have tzimtzum rishon, and the four steps of tzimtzum rishon, which sets up all the tzimtzum after Seder Shtashel, till the tzimtzum of Klipa. All of these concealments is based on the power of Ein Sof L'mayla Ad Ein Kates. In other words, it's not revealing Ein Sof L'mayla Ein Kates. It's the power of Ein Sof to hide, and the power of Ein Sof to hide has a koyach. And that koyach is revealed to Yidden who live in that concealment. And the more that concealment affects us, the more we have it. And the two ideas in avodah that the Rebbe brings out of all of these tzimtzumim is the Mesiras Nefesh idea, Oitzesh Yireh Shamayim and Mesiras Nefesh, and the idea of Mispal Ada Atinag Datmimas idea. And this ends the second class on the Mamer of Tafshin Memhei. So when you think about it, yesterday's class was very chassidish and very avodadik. This class is pure haskalah. It's just levels, new levels, higher levels, but levels. But when the Rebbe spoke about it in the Siches, he wanted it to be clear to the people who were discussing it that the only reason he is saying these levels is because they're written in Kabbalah and brought in Chassidus, because you can't make up levels. You can't use logic to be the basis for how you prove ideas and madregas in Kabbalah. But once they're written in Sifrei Kabbalah, you explain them in the laws of Seichel, which is what the Rebbe just did. What remains for me to do now is to learn the Mamer of Abba Rosh Hashanah Heim, Chamish Asa B'Shvat. 5 days after that, the Rebbe said a second Mamer, and then Vayishmi said a third Mamer. But those two Maimorim are not Basi Legani, right? One of them is about Chamish Asa B'Shvat, and in the middle he brings these Tzimtzumim. And the other one is about Vayishma Yisrei, and it's actually very little about these Tzimtzumim. I'm not fully decided how I'm going to teach those Maimorim yet. Ukafi she's baya lakamen emitz Hashem agut in Erev Shabbos and agut Yom Tif l'shon hateva b'limud hachassidus v'darkei hachassidus tikaseiva v'seichaseimu.